My husband's brother gave me a wicked smile that made my heart pound with fear. "Take off your clothes," he said, his voice thick with evil. "You'll make a baby with me instead." Tears filled my eyes and I shook my head, trembling. "No, please, no!" I cried, my voice barely coming out. Fear had wrapped its tight hands around my throat, making it hard to breathe. In that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I dropped to my knees and clung to my husband's leg, my hands shaking, tears streaming down my face. "Please, baby," I begged, my voice trembling. "There has to be another way. We can solve this problem together. But I can't do this. I can't sleep with your brother. Please don't make me." He looked down at me, silent for a long time. His face softened a little, showing pity. Then slowly, he glanced at his brother and nodded, signaling him to leave the room. I stayed on my knees, sobbing quietly, feeling both relieved and terrified. My husband gently lifted me up, pulling me into his arms and whispered for me to calm down, to stop crying. He left shortly after, saying he needed time to think. That night he returned but didn't say a word. We lay in bed together, side by side, both of us wide awake yet lost in our thoughts. The silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on us. In the dark, I could barely see him, but I could feel his presence beside me. Hours passed before I finally gathered the courage to speak, waking him softly and urging him to talk with me. "Please, just listen," I said, my voice breaking. "I understand that you want a baby, and you can't perform your duty as a husband, but bringing your brother into this is dangerous. One day, he could use it against you, against us." I could see his face tighten in the dim light, and I reached out, holding his hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers as I poured out my heart, but he looked away, his voice soft yet firm. "My brother wouldn't do that," he insisted. "He's my blood, and I trust him. I want him to help us because he's family." Tears welled up again as I pleaded, "There are other options, baby. We could look for someone else, a stranger. We could leave this place, start fresh in a home that's just ours, far from anyone who knows us." I hesitated, my voice trembling as I continued. "I would never imagine being with another man, let alone your brother. But if it means giving you a child, I'll do it. Just let me find the person myself." For hours we went back and forth, voices sometimes soft, sometimes rising with frustration. In the end, after what felt like a lifetime of tears and begging, he finally sighed, his voice low and defeated. He agreed to let me make my choice. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, yet the night still held a strange tension, a sense of uncertainty that lingered in the air. As we lay back down in silence, I wondered what the future would hold. The next morning, I was heading downstairs when I heard voices. My husband and his brother were arguing loudly, and I couldn't help but feel curious. I stepped closer to the door, trying to make out what they were saying without them noticing I was there. My husband was telling his brother that we were moving to another state, but his brother didn't like that one bit. "You can't just move away," his brother hissed. "If you do, you'll lose control over her. If she finds another man, she might leave you for him. You have to keep her close so she doesn't wander." My husband sounded frustrated. "I've already thought about it. I've made up my mind," he replied, his voice firm. But his brother wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing, saying things that made my skin crawl. "If you really want a family," his brother said slyly, "you should let me be the one to give you kids. That way you'll still have your family. Think about it. If you let someone else near her, you could lose her forever." I held my breath, my heart pounding as I listened. I was stunned. Why was my husband's brother so eager to be involved like this? It didn't feel right. It was as if he had some secret plan of his own. He always seemed too eager to step in and take advantage whenever he could. Could he really be trusted? Their voices grew louder, and the argument got more heated. My husband's brother sounded angry and desperate now. "If you leave and go along with her plan, don't come back here. You betrayed me and all our plans." His voice was sharp and full of anger. I realized I had heard too much, and fear washed over me. If they noticed me listening, who knew what they might do? I quickly turned around and tiptoed back up the stairs, my heart racing. One sunny afternoon, weeks after that scary night, my husband and I packed up all our things and moved far away from his family's house. We moved to a new state, a place I chose on purpose because I knew someone special lived there. My old boyfriend, Mark, who used to make me so happy, lived in that state. Back then, Mark and I had been in love, but he didn't want to settle down yet. My parents kept telling me it was time to settle down with someone responsible, someone who could take care of me. Mark was sweet, but he didn't seem to want much from life. He didn't have big dreams or big plans, and that worried me. So, even though it hurt my heart, I broke up with him. Not long after, I met my husband at church. He seemed so perfect, like he was sent by God himself to take care of me. He was everything I wanted, kind, polite, and he went to church all the time. We became friends first, sharing stories and spending time together. Then, 2 months later, we started dating. It felt magical. Every week, he'd surprise me with beautiful flowers and sweet notes. He'd pick me up after work, always arriving with a big, warm smile. He seemed like a prince from a fairy tale, someone who cared deeply for me. We went to church together, prayed together, and he was so devoted. He never missed a church meeting and prayed passionately. I thought I'd finally won at life. One weekend, I stayed over at his house for the first time. When we kissed, he gently pulled away and told me we had to wait until marriage. I was surprised but also happy, thinking, wow, he respects me and wants to do things the right way. I believed he loved God and wanted to make sure our love was pure, but I had no idea he was hiding a secret so big it would change everything. You see, my husband didn't have a manhood, but he didn't tell me, not even once. He just kept it hidden, acting like everything was normal. He had another plan too, one I never saw coming. He wanted me to have a baby with his brother, something I could never have imagined or accepted. Over time, my husband also convinced me to quit my job, saying it was too stressful and didn't pay enough. "You don't need to work there," he'd say with a kind smile. "I'll help you find something better." I trusted him completely, thinking he wanted what was best for me. But deep down, he wanted me to be without money, so I'd depend on him for everything. He wanted control, and I didn't see it. I sat outside, looking at the quiet new house, my thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. Everything felt strange now, and I couldn't shake the anger growing inside me. All those times my husband acted sweet and loving, it was all fake. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hated my husband, not because he didn't have a manhood, but because he lied, because he tried to make me do something so terrible. How could he? It felt like all the love I thought we shared was just an illusion, like he'd been hiding his true self from the start. As I sat there, I made a decision. I would handle this myself. No one would take advice of me anymore. I would show him how this game is played. I must get revenge for all he did to me. 2 weeks passed quietly. My husband hardly spoke to me, and the silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words. Then, early one morning, he called me into the living room. He looked at me with a cold expression and said, "You have 2 more weeks. 2 weeks to find a man who will get you pregnant. If you don't, I'll choose someone myself." His voice was calm, but his eyes had that same disturbing look. My heart pounded, but I kept my face steady, hiding the storm inside. After he left, I picked up my phone and dialed Mark's number. My hands trembled as I waited for him to pick up. When he answered, his voice was warm, just like I remembered. He sounded surprised and excited to hear from me, which made me feel a bit better. We agreed to meet later that evening at a quiet little restaurant nearby. That night, as I walked into the restaurant, my heart beat faster. Mark was sitting by the window, waiting for me. The moment he saw me, his face lit up with a smile, and it felt like a small bit of happiness found its way back into my life. I sat down and we talked, catching up on everything we'd missed. Then I took a deep breath and told him everything. The truth about my husband, his lies, and the twisted plan he wanted me to follow. Mark's face grew serious. He looked at me with sadness in his eyes and said, "I can't believe he did that to you. You deserve so much better." He reached out and held my hand, his warmth calming my fears. Then he surprised me by saying, "I still care about you. I always have. If you need me, I'll be here." Hearing those words made my heart feel lighter. like a weight had been lifted. I knew Mark was someone I could trust, someone who had always been real with me. I asked him if he'd come back with me to meet my husband, and he agreed, nodding firmly. We left the restaurant and walked back to my house. My husband was waiting, sitting on the couch with a strange, expectant look. He glanced at Mark and then at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Who's this?" he asked. "This is Mark," I said simply. "I met him on an app." I kept my voice calm and steady, not letting on that Mark was someone from my past. My husband didn't question it further, but I could see his eyes darken with something like jealousy. I managed to convince my husband to let Mark move in with us. I told him it would make things easier, so we wouldn't have to sneak around to hotels and raise suspicion. My husband agreed, wanting to look like a perfect, honorable man in front of others. Even at our new church, he had already become one of the most devoted members. He wanted everyone to see him as a saint. When Mark moved in, things took a surprising turn. That first night was something else. I had already planned everything with Mark, and together, we were going to teach my husband a lesson he wouldn't forget. After taking a bath, I lay in bed next to my husband, acting calm and pretending nothing was wrong. Then, just a few minutes later, Mark walked into the bedroom. He wasn't wearing a shirt, his bare chest visible in the dim light. He walked over, looking at me and then glancing at my husband. Before either of us could say anything, he came closer to the bed, and then he kissed me right there in front of my husband. My husband's eyes went wide with shock. He stammered, his voice shaking, "Will you leave my wife alone?" But Mark didn't back down. He looked my husband right in the eyes and smirked. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. No Manhood," Mark said with a mocking tone, "but it's time for us to make that baby." My husband froze, his face pale as he realized he'd lost control of the situation. Tears filled his eyes, and he slowly backed out of the room, completely broken. He thought he could push me into something I didn't want, but now he was the one suffering. As soon as he left, Mark and I continued our plan. I made sure he could hear every word, my voice rising louder and louder. I whispered sweet things to Mark, words that I knew would drive my husband mad with jealousy and pain. Every sound, every laugh, every whisper was part of the revenge I was planning, and I felt no guilt. That night was just the beginning. I wasn't going to stop until my husband felt every bit of the betrayal and hurt he had caused me. The next morning, I walked out of the bedroom holding a bundle of dirty clothes, mine and Mark's. My husband was sitting in the living room, staring off into space, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. His eyes were red, like he had been crying all night. I didn't say hello or look at him with any kindness. Instead, I tossed the dirty clothes onto his lap and told him, "Wash these. I need them clean." He blinked, surprised, and then looked up at me. "Why would I wash your clothes? And Mark's?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, we were busy all night working on the bed," I said, adding a cold, cruel smile. "I know you wouldn't understand, but we're tired and I need those clothes clean." His face went pale with shock. Then he stood up, anger finally breaking through his sadness. "How dare you speak to me like that? I'm your husband!" I looked him right in the eye. "You stopped being my husband the day you tried to ruin my life by making me sleep with your brother," I said, my voice filled with contempt. "Now, Mr. No Manhood, get busy with the laundry." He stared at me, stunned, refusing to move. "I'm not going to wash those clothes," he said, his voice trembling. I stepped closer, my tone ice cold. "If you don't, you'll regret it. I'll tell everyone, the church, the neighborhood, that you don't have a manhood. I'll tell them you plan to let your brother take advantage of me. You have no idea what I can do now." His face fell, realizing he was trapped. Slowly, he picked up the clothes and walked out to wash them. I watched him go, feeling no pity, only the deep ache of betrayal and the fire of revenge. From that day on, I made his life miserable. I would kiss Mark right in front of him, making sure he saw every bit of affection and love I gave to someone else. I made him do all the house chores and humiliated him whenever I could. I wanted him to feel powerless, just like he had made me feel. One night, I told Mark I wanted my husband to sit in the room and watch us make love. Mark agreed, smirking, ready to go along with my plan. My husband tried to avoid coming into the bedroom, but I insisted. He finally walked in, looking broken, and sat on the couch, watching as Mark and I held each other close, whispering things that should only be shared between husband and wife. I lifted my head and glanced at my husband. Tears were streaming down his cheeks as he watched, his face a mask of despair. In that moment, he looked like a man who had lost everything. And in truth, he had. He had lost me, my respect, and any love I had once felt for him. Days went by, and I saw him losing himself more and more. Sometimes he would go into a room by himself and cry like a lost child. He stopped going to church, stopped caring about the things he used to love. His spirit was broken, and I could see that my revenge had changed him. But no matter how much he suffered, I didn't feel sorry for him. All I felt was the deep, burning anger he had lit inside me when he tried to ruin my life. Now, he was the one suffering, just as he had made me suffer. And for me, that was justice. One evening, I came home from the mall with Mark, carrying a bag full of new things we had bought together. As soon as I stepped into the house, I was hit by a strange sight. My husband was sprawled out on the couch, snoring loudly. He looked completely out of it. I felt a mix of surprise and confusion because he never drank alcohol. The house was a total mess, with dishes piled up in the sink and crumbs scattered on the floor. "Hey," I said, shaking him gently. "Wake up. Why didn't you clean the house or wash the dishes?" He blinked and sat up, looking at me with bleary eyes. "Am I your maid?" he slurred, sounding annoyed. His words sparked something inside me, and I shouted back, "Don't talk to me like that, you weak man." The tension in the room grew thicker, and Mark stood there watching us silently, unsure of what to do. Just as I turned to leave, my husband grabbed my arm and slapped me hard across the face. The sting shocked me, and I couldn't believe he would hurt me like that. Before I could react, Mark sprang into action. He stepped forward and slapped my husband right back, hard enough to make him stumble. I turned to Mark, my heart racing. "Don't you ever lay a hand on my husband," I yelled. Mark looked taken aback, his mouth opening in surprise. I continued, my voice trembling with anger. "You cheated on me when we were dating, and I forgave you. What makes you better than him?" I was furious, and I pointed toward the door. "Please, just go in there, pack your things, and leave my house." Mark stared at me, shocked and hurt. He didn't say a word. Instead, he walked into the other room, picked up his bags, and left without another word. I felt a wave of regret wash over me, and I sank onto the bed, crying. I couldn't believe what I had become. My life felt like a tangled mess. As tears streamed down my face, my husband entered the room. He knelt before me, his eyes pleading. "I'm so sorry for everything," he said, his voice shaky. "I didn't tell you the truth. I lied, but one thing is real. I love you. I loved you then, and I still love you now. Please forgive me." I continued crying, my heart breaking at his words. "I have forgiven you from the bottom of my heart," I said between sobs. "But I can't stay in this marriage anymore. I need to find happiness again." He begged me to stay, pleading with tears in his eyes, but deep down, I knew I had to go. I packed my bags, feeling a heavy weight on my heart. I called my best friend, asking if I could stay with her until I figured out what to do next. My friend agreed to help me, leaving my husband all alone, lying on the floor and crying. I felt strange as I walked out of the house, my heart heavy. But I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I went to my friend's place, where I felt safe, away from all the pain and confusion. But even there, I didn't feel completely okay. After a few days, I told my friend I wanted to go to therapy. I needed someone to help me understand what was happening inside me. Sometimes I felt guilty for everything I had done, feeling like I'd crossed a line I never thought I would. Other times, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, like I had finally taken back some control, but the mix of these feelings left me lost, like I didn't even know who I was anymore. During my first therapy session, I sat quietly, nervous, as the therapist looked at me with gentle eyes. She asked me to tell her my story, and as I began to talk, I felt the weight of every choice, every action, all crashing down on me. The room felt so quiet as I spoke, but each word seemed to echo louder in my mind, and I could feel tears start to prick my eyes. It's been 8 months since I left my marriage. I found a good job, and slowly, I began to feel happy again. I hoped that love would find me again someday. But for now, I was determined to live my life to the fullest. One sunny day, I decided to take a walk in the park near my new apartment. As I strolled along the path, I noticed the bright flowers blooming and kids playing on the swings. It felt good to be outside, enjoying the fresh air. Suddenly, I heard laughter behind me. I turned around and saw a little girl running toward her mom, her arms wide open as if to embrace the world. The joy on her face made me smile. I remembered when I used to feel that carefree and happy dot, then, something caught my eye. A man was sitting on a bench nearby reading a book. He looked up and our eyes met. There was something warm and inviting in his gaze. He smiled at me, and I felt a flutter in my heart, a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for love to find me again. As I walked by, I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in months. I realized that I was finally moving forward, leaving the past behind. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to embrace it, one step at a time. And in that moment, I knew that I was on the right path to finding true happiness again.